Hi everybody, my name is Megan Cias, and the book that I chose for this book report is News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race and the American Media, and is by Juan Gonzalez and Joseph Torres. This book was definitely in no way a leisurely read. It had more of a textbook kind of feel, but it was super informative, and I think that it really targeted um, the topic of race and class in the media really well. So this book covers from the earliest colonial newspapers all the way into the internet age. So we go back really far to the beginning of media all the way up until recently. And it covers, the United States and how that media has progressed and changed over time. And I like to highlight that it's called News for All of the People, and that's because it really highlights minorities. It went over, I gave a good section of Hispanics and Native Americans, African Americans, and Chinese, and it really highlights their experiences and their advances they made to get within the media, to get published solely within their race. To have their voices heard, because each individual group felt that they were misrepresented or incorrectly misrepresented by local white newspapers. They felt that they were being really racially oppressed, and that people were only hearing one side of the story, and that their voices weren't heard. So I think this book really reveals how racial segregation distorted the info that Americans received from the mainstream media, and so these individual groups created their own newspapers and published their own newspapers that they could share their viewpoints and their stories because they weren't being shared otherwise. So one thing that really stood out to me was that these groups shared their newspapers not only in their native tongue but as well in English, and that's because they didn't want these newspapers just to be for themselves. They wanted them to be informative for everyone so that their voices could be heard. They wanted white people to understand what they were going through because they were only hearing one side of the story. So that was really interesting. So like the Native Americans, would publish their newspapers in Cherokee as well as English, and Hispanics would publish their papers in Spanish as well as English. And I thought that was really interesting and cool. So this book really contributes to a greater part of the story of the media control and ownership that traces back to the creation of the United States. It reflects that media that it was somewhat biased and controlled by one group, and so only one story was being told, and it really highlights the racial oppression back then. One thing that I'd like to read from the book is actually from Mark Twain, and you'll hear why in a second. So it says, "The Brennan Street butchers set their dogs on a Chinaman who was quietly passing with a basket of clothes on his head, and while the dogs mutilated his flesh, a butcher increased the hilarity of the occasion by knocking some of the Chinaman's teeth down his throat with half a brick. This incident sticks in my memory with a more malevolent tenacity, perhaps, on account of the fact that I was in the employ of a San Francisco journal at the time, and was not allowed to publish it because it might offend some of the peculiar element that subscribed for the paper." So basically, during this time, Mark Twain was an employee for a San Francisco journal. He saw this incident occur and he wanted to publish it, and he was told no because it might offend or portray the white man in a negative light. So he was not allowed to do that. Yet newspapers during this time really highlighted these minorities in an ugly light. for Native Americans, that they were savages and they skinned people and this and that. That was the news that they portrayed on these Native Americans, and that's the viewpoint that people believed. And reflecting on that time period, this was the only news source that you were receiving, and if you weren't interacting with Native Americans, you didn't know that they were just people like you, and so you became fearful of them. And that's what was happening to all these minorities. They were being portrayed in negative light, and and people believed it because that was the information they were being told. And I think that really reflects to today's time as well, because we base our opinions off of the information we receive, whether it be from CNN or Fox News. We kind of take that information and form an opinion on someone or something based off of it. Luckily nowadays with the internet, we have the opportunity to say, I'm not really sure about that. Let me look into it more and take it upon ourselves to dig deeper and to look and see, through different web sources, through different articles, through different journalists, like inform your own opinion. So you're not just limited to one source of information and you have to make an opinion of someone or something off of that. You can form your own opinion. So luckily we have that nowadays, but back then they didn't. And so people were very fearful of these other minorities, and they were portrayed in a negative light. So that was the main reason that these minorities began to not only publish their stories in newspapers, but have their stories published in newspapers that were solely by them, by their race. But I found it very interesting that even though that was the case, the one thing that Hispanic and Chinese newspapers had in common with white newspapers, the one thing that they agreed on was slavery. And to me, that kind of blew my mind and baffled me a little bit, because as a minority, they were being oppressed. And so they already knew, like, well, this information about us is false. That these white people are saying about us is false or badly misinterpreted, but yet they believed it about a different racial group. So that kind of baffled me a little bit. But I think that goes back just to showing the lack of information that was provided at the time. Without that, you don't really get to form your own opinion. For example, like my grandparents grew up to be racist against African Americans, and now they're not, and they voted for our first African American president, and it's because now and I know, like, they're very remorseful that they were raised that way and that they had those beliefs back then, but it goes back to that limited supply of information. Now they can form their own opinions and make their own opinions, and they're given all these different sources. But back then, their parents were taught this and that, and that's what they believed. And I think that kind of still can go with today. It still happens today. You can hear something about a Muslim group and you're completely racist towards that entire group, when you kind of have to look at the different facts and look at different sources. And I think that is something that we're still progressing on in regards to racial oppression, but it's definitely something that the United States has advanced on over the years, and I think that this book definitely shows that and portrays that and puts that in a greater perspective, that that's how it was now, and that's how it was then, and that this is how it is now, and we still have steps to take to knock down the walls of racial repression, but we've definitely continued to move in the right steps, and I think that the media is a big part of how we are able to continue to do that. So that's all for me. Definitely check out this book if you're interested in learning more about this topic. I just gave that small piece from the book from Mark Twain, but there's a lot of really insightful things in this book, just like that, we aren't really knowledgeable about, that we kind of have brushed under the rug. And I think that it's important to hear these different stories to be able to continue to progress. So that's it. Thanks.